Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Campaign for Working Connecticut's 2026 Legislative Session Recap webinar. My name is Daniel Fitzmaurice. I'm the Director of Advocacy here at United Way of Connecticut, and we have a fantastic agenda so that you can leave with a much clearer sense of what happened this last legislative session up in Hartford, particularly when it comes to workers, their families, their employers. That's really going to be the focus of our conversation today. You Here's a quick agenda that we're going to cover as succinctly as we can, because there's so much that happens over the course of a legislative session where hundreds of bills are proposed and a handful pass. But if you could drop in the chat, your name, your organization, and I'd be really curious to know if there was, one law that the state of Connecticut passed just for you, just something you wish could happen, what would that law be? So don't lose too much sleep over it, but I think it's an interesting question to think about as we talk about laws that did pass and didn't pass in 2026. We're going to first go through, what happened in this legislative session, and we're going to do it in kind of an interesting way. We're going to kind of talk about the big wins. What are those incredible accomplishments that we think you all should know about, as well as your workers and employers and families, the big outcomes from the session? They're going to make a big difference in our communities. But then we're also going to move into, more of the category of like, well, here's some work we have to keep doing. And I'll just mention now, we as a coalition focus on a bunch of different topics, and we also learn about a lot of different topics as the legislative session goes through and beyond. So we're going to do a little bit of both today in the legislative session recap. We also are really glad to have somebody here from the Office of Workforce Strategies to talk about the Workforce Pell Grants work, which is another change that's coming to our communities that we wanted to make sure y'all knew about. And we would never let you leave without knowing what to do to help. So we're going to make sure everyone knows how to get involved in our coalition and the things we're thinking about moving forward. So before we do, let me just explain, if you're unfamiliar with what this coalition is all about, we are really a very diverse and broad coalition focused on having a fair and equitable workforce broadly defined. And so really trying to understand what it means to have a strong and healthy workforce. Right now, there's still 71,000 job openings across the state. That number has hovered around that for quite a long time. And we all know how important it is to have a stable job that pays a stable wage that your family can rely on. And so we do that through all kinds of educational opportunities like this one. We engage with legislators at the state level directly during and outside of the legislative session. And we also try to do as much as we can in the public domain so that folks understand what is important about this topic and what's important to make sure we center workers and consider workers in all the decisions the state's making. We have three fantastic co-chairs who you are going to meet periodically on the way. Jim Boucher from Capital Workforce Partners, Amy Casavina Hall from United Way of Connecticut, and Kristen Hempel from EastCon. So they kind of help us steer the ship and move things along. So without further ado, let's get right to it. And don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat or use the quick Q&A function. We will monitor that as we go through these slides so that we can make sure that, I know it's a webinar, but we could be as interactive as you all would like it to be and as it would be helpful to be as we move through these topics. This was the 2026 legislative session. It was, what we call the short session. So it only ran from February until May. And it's designed to not be as much about budget as much as about policy. And so I think you'll see that reflected in some of the choices that ended up making it to the finish line. And that's precisely where we're going to start, at the finish line. What were the wins that we think are really important for everybody to know about when it comes to workers and employers? I'm going to invite our friend Kristen to share a little bit about that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. So first of all, it's great to be here with all of you today. I'm gonna start off by just talking a little bit about the landscape of adult education funding this year. So we started off the fiscal year looking at a significant cut, as you know, to our adult ed funds here in the state of Connecticut, about a 13% cut. Um, and we got loud, and we appreciate all the support from you all, and we were able to get $1.7 million restored into that budget for the fiscal year FY26. Then when the governor's recommended allocations for this upcoming year, FY27, came out. We were cut again around $4.3 million. However, again, through an outcry across the state and on the Hill, we were able to get most of that restored around so that we were able to actually come back with a little bit of a cut to our adult education, but less than $500,000, which means that we are going to be able to continue to provide high quality services. It makes us meet closer to the financial picture that we had several years ago, which is wonderful for our programs and for our learners and our workforce across the board. So very excited about where we stand and where we're going from here. I don't know, Jim, if you'd like to talk a little bit about the summer youth employment.
Sure. Thank, thank you, Kristen. And I think, many of us, again, Jim Boucher from Capital Workforce Partners, we're one of the five workforce development boards in the state, and glad to be part of the campaign for Work in Connecticut. Around summer youth employment, you probably recall going back to a few years ago, one of the recommendations from the 119K Commission was to support ensuring there were no waiting lists for youth employment programs for summer youth employment. And we continue to strive towards that goal. So this past year, we did see an increase in summer youth employment from $7.7 million to $10 million, which was a significant increase, which is very positive. At the same time, we're still, while we are seeing increased numbers of young people served, still seeing only one individual for every 3 or 4 individuals that apply to summer youth employment. So while we're excited about the success to increase youth employment, we know that it's still a significant effort to ensure that there are no waiting lists for youth. So that was the positive movement. And the second thing I would mention as part of our work around young people having access to work-based learning, we did have some success in disconnected youth bill that made its way through the Education Committee, which would have created a disconnected youth fund. While that did not get to a final vote by the Assembly, it did see more movement this year than it did in years past. So again, I think setting some momentum for the upcoming legislative session.
Thank you, Jim. I think you're making a very important point there about there's the work that we're doing that we're focusing on and coming back to as our top priorities. And sometimes we make these big wins, and sometimes we're moving the needle, and we're laying the seeds for progress and wins in the near future. But it's also important to look at what's going on in the whole landscape of the priorities that we have. And so there's some other wins that have happened on the Capitol that we want to make sure you're aware of that impact the work that we're doing and are connected to our mission here. So one of those is the no excuse absentee ballots. So they are now available to any eligible voter, which makes it easier for workers across all shifts to vote by mail if they choose to. Another one, no cost school breakfasts. Very important, right? So now they are available to all public school students, making mornings easier for workers and with their children, right? So that's around a $12 million investment there, well spent. Immigration protections, another issue that cuts across so many of our agencies, but this creates protected areas where civil immigration arrests require judicial warrant. Schools, hospitals, houses of worship, food banks, shelters, playgrounds, and bus stops. Artificial intelligence regulations, hot topic, right? What is going on with artificial intelligence? So this is one of the most comprehensive state level policies. We're leading the nation here, folks. So this creates the Connecticut AI Academy, which is workforce upskilling. It's an AI regulatory sandbox program. DECD developed a plan, and the report is due January 1st in 2028. An AI learning laboratory program, an artificial intelligence workforce research hub, as well as multiple advisory and working groups. Super excited to see where all of this will land in 2028. Additionally, it establishes disclosure requirements for automated employment-related decision technology. So that's automated employment related decision technology. So this means employers are using AI in hiring. We know this. They're using it in promotion, they're using it in discipline or discharge decisions, and they must notify effective applicants and employees. Next, employers using WARN Act layoff notices must disclose whether the layoffs relate to AI or to other technological change. And that's going to go, or that was effective October 1st, 2026. Additionally, it amends the Connecticut Fair Employment Practices Act to state explicitly that using an AI tool is not a legal defense against a discrimination claim. And courts and CHRO may consider proactive anti-bias testing as a mitigating factor. Finally, it also regulates AI companion chatbots for self-harm detection protocols, minor protections, and all that went into place on January 1st, 2027, or will go into place January 1st, 2027. I'm ahead of myself here with my years. And Frontier AI model whistleblower protections. So that's a lot that has happened down in Hartford that, again, is deeply impacting Connecticut's workers. And I think I'm now turning it over back to Daniel.
Yes, thanks, Kristen. That's a great rundown of topics. And yeah, again, I'll definitely name that our coalition was not necessarily watching all of these, the progress over the last number of years in artificial intelligence. And it seems like something, certainly something to consider watching from a worker perspective. That's sort of everyday conversation I know folks have around the water cooler, right? When will I be replaced by AI? And it seems like Connecticut is taking some steps in the right direction, some big wins. It's one of the biggest AI regulations I think the country's seen. So moving on to a little bit of a middle ground here, not everything is a win or a loss. So we wanted to talk about some areas where we're making progress. We're headed down the road. And I really think I'm grateful that Meryl Gay is here from the Early Childhood Alliance to help us understand more about this because there's no doubt that we're making huge progress towards expanding access to really high quality and affordable childcare and early childhood education through this endowment. But I think there's so many things we should understand about that as employers and workers so that we're centering, when all of that's going to start to come into place. So thanks for getting us started here on this making progress category, Meryl.
Okay. So I guess first, just like a little bit of reality check, despite what some politicians are saying, we don't have universal childcare in Connecticut, and it'll be a long time before we get there. The $411 million that just got deposited into the endowment is a great step to keep us on track for where we want to go. And that sort of where we're trying to get to starting July 1 of next year, the families in the Early Start program, which currently is about 18,420 kids, will not pay more than 7% of their income for childcare. And all the families under 100,000, which is about 90% of those families, won't pay anything. That was the thing put into the law that is the sort of immovable milestone. And in April, we were very afraid when we saw the comptroller's projections that they weren't going to make a deposit this year, and the early childhood programs that provide early start services were going to be left holding the bag when they couldn't charge parent tuition anymore. So it looks like we're past that. Now the question is how big a deposit will be made in 2027, because that will be the money that can be used to raise rates to providers so they can raise wages and to expand to serve some more kids. OEC wants to do another 1,000 slot expansion and to do a rate increase, but that's all contingent on whether there's another deposit. And 400 million sounds like a huge amount of money, but remember, you can only use 10% of it each year. So we spend about $760 million of state, local, and federal dollars on early childhood. And so far, the endowment can put in 70 million more. So that's, a 10% increase is great, but it's not the earth-shattering stuff that some elected officials' advertisements might lead you to believe.
That is exactly what I was hoping you were going to help clarify for us, Meryl. Can I ask you just one more question about this?
Sure.
Because I know there's two dimensions, and I just think there's a certainly for workers who make 100, this is transformative for workers potentially who will be able to pay so much less for childcare in some future time than they currently are. But can you also just speak a little bit about the rate issue? I know you mentioned it briefly, but how are childcare workers currently, compensated and paid? Like, how does that stack up, and how will this endowment help?
You can make more money walking pets than working in early childhood. Our stated goal is to bring those early educators to parity with their public school counterparts. But there's a long way to go before we get there. And the rate increase, OEC is trying to figure out how they're going to replace the lost parent fees, which currently help support all of those programs, as well as give a rate increase on top aimed at trying to raise wages. And yeah, there's still a long way to go to be able to get programs up to where they need to be. We currently pay about a little over 11,000 for a preschool slot. The cost estimates, if you were paying teachers equivalent to public school teachers, is that it would need to be more like 19.
Wow.
So there's a long way to go before we could get to the point where we're at parity.
Well, I knew you'd have the right answers to those things. Thank you for joining us to give us a brief kind of overview on that. If you've got quiz questions for Meryl, put them in the chat and we'll come back to them. I think it's, the workforce in our state, like most states, are child raising. That's just the common truth. Folks are, living longer, working longer, but, if we can't keep workers who are raising children in our state and help them get through it, then it's pretty tricky to have a stable and inclusive workforce. I'm going to pass it over to my great colleague, Cheryl, to cover some more of these areas where we're making some progress this year.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Cheryl Hargrave. I'm the advocacy coordinator here for United Way of Connecticut. Want to touch base on a couple of different things around transportation and things around education commissions. So Senate Bill 9 had passed with like two main focuses that I want to talk to you about. First one is the microtransit portion of it. So this was an effort to try to provide a different option for transportation to work, doctor's appointments, things like that. That was back statewide, where a rider could use an app or call a phone number to do like a ride share option that was much cheaper than like someone using Lyft or Uber. So what they did in this bill, even though they didn't expand the communities in which they're serving, they did extend it for another year. So that's where we want to like make the progress. We want to be able to like highlight and show how much effort that is actually happening in those communities. Currently, 17 communities are utilizing the service, and they have allocated $10.5 million for that, just to expand it for another year. There's a lot of other encouragements, but just wanted to highlight that one first. Second thing I want to talk about is free buses for both veterans and kids. So there was a little back and forth. The prior legislative session around veterans, this session it kind of got beefed up and moved out. So really what that means is veterans now can get a free bus pass. They have an infrastructure for them to be able to get that if they need it. So that's already kind of like built into the service. And then there's also free bus passes for children. Now, there were some that were set up in the pilot originally in like Hartford and New Haven. Now it's extended statewide, but we're not really clear on like how each of those students are going to be able to get that as an option. I did see the question really quick. For veterans, it is full now. It was prior, not this past session, the session before. It was proposed to be half for veterans, and now it's full coverage for veterans to have free transportation for the kids. You're more than welcome. But prior, again, right, there were already some communities, especially for like college students, that already had some like free transportation options. So we're just kind of really keeping an eye on this to figure out like how that's actually moving apart for the kids, where like we were already talking about childcare, right? And that was predominantly for the younger kids, but there's still older kids that have a part-time job or have sports or other things where it would have pulled the parent away from work to transport them, that now they could potentially use public transportation. So we really want to keep an eye on that and see how effective that is with the workforce overall. Next two things I want to talk about is just two commissions that have been set up. So there's the Blue Ribbon Commission and there's the Connecticut Career Pathways Commission. So I just wanted to highlight these two so you understand like the difference between and like what their focus is going to be for over the summer, and then what they're supposed to produce by the time the next legislative class is introduced. So the Blue Ribbon Commission sole focus is going to be on K-12 education funding and accountability. So it is currently going to be chaired by Natalie Wagner. She's the Deputy Chief of Staff for the Office of Governors. So their main kind of focus is going to be requiring the look of landscape or education funding for Connecticut, any relevant models from other states, the primary costs for driving impacting school districts, and proven strategies in developing like K through 12 education that might result in positive outcomes for both families and students, like in their success overall. Their report is going to be, their report for recommendations are going to be, they're deemed for January 15th of 2027. So that's just before the next legislative session and class starts, where the Connecticut Career Pathways Commission is being chaired by the former U.S. Department of Secretary Miguel Cardona, who's also currently working within the Meriden Public School System. And he's also a part of OWS, Office of Workforce Strategy. So that committee's goal is really going to be leaning in on like ensuring that learners and workers have access to high quality industry aligned pathways that will lead them to any accreditations that might be popping up or make those individuals more eligible for the workforce as it's like kind of turning into some of this AI things, and really pointing them toward good jobs. Because if they're getting accreditations for jobs that no longer exist, right, or being morphed into something else, that accreditation is not helpful to our workforce. So a big chunk of that is going to be trying to put that focus on what accreditations our workforce and adult education and some of our GED learners might want to start going on a path for. So a couple of highlights for that. Access to Connecticut's current education and path and career pathways systems is what they're going to try to start with, ground level, to get a grasp of that, and then utilize the engaged stakeholders across the state to ensure understand any needs or barriers to any of the upcoming things that they're seeing, identify opportunities to strengthen education, workforce, and the industry connection. Also developing recommendations to strengthen the career pathway and expand opportunities for students and workers across Connecticut. This commission is going to utilize this time to then develop a 5-year strategy plan. And then that plan is also to be presented by February 2027. So we're both living in that just before the new legislative session starts, where those reports are going to be, they have deadlines for us to look at, right? And potentially reach out to those committees if we feel like we have a stance or a voice to be able to talk to them about and be able to give our point of view.
Cheryl, and you said exactly what I was going to make sure you said, that like these, we could criticize how studies and commissions are like treading water, but they're only treading water if we let them be, right? If either of those commissions feels relevant to your work, your organization, or your workers, you got to jump in now to start to inform those processes and influence those processes. And again, it kind of bookends really nicely with the conversation about the incredible progress we've made on early childhood education, which was due to many, many decades of studies and blue ribbon panel that happened a couple of years ago as well. So, these things can really make that progress can become a win in a couple of years if we work together on that. So definitely things to bookmark as we move from now into the next legislative session, which starts already in January. I know it doesn't seem like that's around the corner, but it truly is. And unfortunately, the bearer of bad news is my colleague Amy Casavina Hall, who is going to run through what we like to call in our office for sure, unfinished business, right? There are really no losses. It's just work. We are going to continue policies. We are going to continue to advocate until they happen.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. Amy Casavina Hall from United Way of Connecticut. I love this. I learn so many things every time we get together, jotting down notes. It's so helpful because I don't know about you, but I can't be everywhere all the time, understanding and learning everything. So it's so exciting to hear from places that I just pass by me and I know I care, but it doesn't really hit. So thankful to everyone who's on the call. Please do share your thoughts and what's on your mind and questions you have or things you're tracking. And of course, all the panelists on today. So lots of appreciation. And yes, my favorite euphemism, unfinished business. So let's get into it. Jim talked a little bit about this already, kind of in our opening when he talked about investment in opportunity youth programs, but just to refresh, right? One of the big things that folks that care about opportunity youth, right? These are young people who are outside of school and outside of work. And not finding ways into either of those systems or find success, who we want to support on that just natural pathway of life of into work and into adulthood. What we've been advocating for together for the last couple of years is an investment in the programs that directly are working in community with these young people very hard. And we have a whole network of amazing organizations doing that work in Connecticut. We'd love to see that grow longer, but first we'd love to see state support for those folks already doing that work, right? Support the work that they're doing so they can continue to do the work and help every child who has already raised their hand saying, yes, I want support. And that money is not there. So we're strong and passionate about this one. I know many of you on the call and out there in the coalition are too. Unfinished business for next legislative session. How do we see that happen? Then the child tax credit. You hear us talk about that one a lot, but say it again, right? We are a complete outlier in New England and really the country, but New England all around us is really flexing strong. And there's kind of this dark spot, sorry to say it, with love in Connecticut right now, that we are a state with a very high cost of living, but does not have any tax policy that says it's really expensive to raise kids, and we're going to give you some type of tax break based on that. Our neighbors all have adopted policies like these and have recently expanded policies like these. So our child tax credit, our proposal for the last 7 years has been $600 per child, with generous income thresholds to make sure we're hitting very low income households, right? As well as Alice households up to, we know it takes a lot of money to live in Connecticut, right? So an expansive economic income threshold there to help people afford the cost of raising kids. We will be back next year to work on the child tax credit. And just want to thank the amazing legislative support we got to make this happen. Over 100 legislators supported this legislation, many bills filed, huge momentum, but we hit a brick wall in terms of getting it passed. And hopefully next session for the long session, we can get this into law and really help support Connecticut families and workers who are trying to deal with wages that in nowhere have kept up with the cost of just a rising cost of household essentials. We just need to help families pay for food, education, childcare, healthcare, transportation, all the important things we're talking about. All right, moving on to nutrition assistance or SNAP. Of course, the big context for this is HR 1, the big bill passed federally, right? Which policies are different, a whole set of policies, both in terms of changing who's eligible for SNAP, as well as changing kind of backroom things, really has just put huge pressure on shrinking the amount of people in the country in Connecticut who are eligible for food assistance through SNAP, right? And we were talking earlier, somehow there's this misnomer that people on SNAP don't work, which is strange because the vast majority of people who receive SNAP do work. And now it is a requirement in SNAP. And that's one of the reasons that even with folks who have many conditions or challenges in working, will likely fall off of SNAP. So we have, I believe from the numbers I saw in June, about 50,000 people in Connecticut already have fallen off the SNAP rolls since HR 1 was implemented. That's a really big number. In response, the state has really focused on investing in food pantries to make that happen. And so we are very happy about seeing those investments. And also recently there was post-session, an additional $8.5 million from that federal reserve fund to respond to changes in federal policies was invested in those $300 grocery gift cards, which people can access by going to their community action agencies. Again, really applaud flexible dollars in people's pockets so they can spend that money on groceries. These are really important things, but just to say, they're not SNAP. Right? The amount of money that SNAP provides, the flexibility that SNAP provides by having a card that you bring to a place that sells food and charging your food against is not the same as a one-time gift card or the amazing work our food pantry partners, I think I got that correct, across the state are working so hard to serve people, but fully funded with all the resources, it's not the same as SNAP. So we'll be back looking for flexible options to help people who've lost their SNAP benefits have something like that SNAP benefit back so they can continue to feed themselves and their families and work, right? And do with all the things they do to care for themselves, their families, and our communities. And then finally, unfinished business is Career Connect and federal funding gaps. And Jim, you've talked about this a little bit, but I get to hand it over to you now to bring us your Career Connect and workforce wisdom, as you always do.
Great. Thank you, Amy. And I think as we've been talking about the campaign for working Connecticut and, one of our, major goals of really looking at economic self-sufficiency for all residents in Connecticut, as well as quality career pathways for employers. As we, talk about where we're at right now around workforce development, we're really looking towards how do we build on the success that Connecticut has had in recent years, where there was and has been a major effort around Career Connect that has supported literally thousands of individuals in Connecticut that were unemployed, underemployed, and were looking for good jobs to get into training and then placed into jobs. It really, has become a national model, and so many workforce development entities, workforce boards, different stakeholders, working with Office of Workforce Strategy, really saw significant support that also included ensuring there were critical talent needs being supported in key industries. And I think many of us have been concerned about the federal funds that have been cut from programs that supported Career Connect and other kinds of workforce training programs, where we lost almost 70% of training capacity throughout the state that federal funds had supported through workforce programming. And there has been a lot of work to really ensure that there be new investments mobilized to keep the momentum going that has been built, continue to sustain and build Career Connect, as well as supporting other workforce training programs. And, part of the work of many people who are on this call to advocate and really lift up the importance of this as a priority. We're optimistic that the state really is looking further at how to mobilize resources to really address this training issue that we are looking at, and really anticipating in the upcoming weeks to be seeing more, I think, positive news around there being potential venues of funding going into some of these training programs. Some of it's probably still being worked on, but I think we're seeing responses from the state to address this issue. So the advocacy and lifting up the importance of training to job seekers. I think, Amy, you were mentioning SNAP, and some of the, as we know, also Medicaid work requirements are about to happen. The critical need for workforce training to support, a number of residents who are at risk of these significant federal challenges is something I think the state leaders are even further bringing to the top of their priorities, and likely to do more around, as we've been hearing some of the potential venues that they're going to be looking at. So just wanted to give that update. We think more information, more news will be coming on that shortly.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Amy. It's actually a perfect pivot, but I don't want to not ask for questions. If you have any, don't hesitate to drop them in the chat. We could chat you back in real time to get to it. But it's an interesting pivot to what Jim was saying, because this issue and opportunity really around workforce Pell Grants is really a connection between the way the federal government and our state government and our communities all work together. And there's going to be a lot of interesting things coming ahead. And that's why I'm really glad that Ben is here to walk us through it, because you're working on it as we speak. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Ben Hensley. I'm with the Office of Workforce Strategy. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Workforce Pell. So I'll cover first kind of what it is, and then secondly, where we are as a state and kind of what comes next with the Workforce Pell implementation. So Workforce Pell comes out of HR 1, the big bill. This is one of the few, I think, bright spots that we've seen coming out of that legislation. And essentially, it expands the availability of Pell Grant funding from its traditional focus just on degree programs to now allow low-income learners to access those dollars for short-term workforce programs. So at a very basic level, this expands the availability of tuition assistance for low-income students. But there's a big caveat that it is only for a select kind of subset of eligible programs. So the Workforce Pell legislation comes with an array of new criteria, new accountability measures that eligible programs will need to demonstrate before they can be approved for Workforce Pell funding. So while learners will only need to fill out the FAFSA and identify that low-income status, identify a program, institutions that want to offer workforce Pell programs and access this funding need to go through a fairly complicated approval process. So I won't go through maybe all of those criteria, but some of the highlights are only Title IV eligible institutions are eligible to deliver workforce Pell programs. That's primarily your colleges, your universities. There are some carve-outs where they can partner with other institutions to deliver training programs. There's also carve-outs for the related technical instruction that comes with registered apprenticeship programs. But then there's other criteria around, things like program length, where it needs to be between 8 to 15 weeks, between 150 to 599 credit hours. All programs have to demonstrate 70% completion rates as well as 70% job placement rates. And we have to verify those placement rates using administrative data. So looking at wage record matches to see when a learner graduates and then where are they in the labor market. Programs also have to align to a list of priority occupations the state's developing. And so this is an opportunity for the state to identify criteria that we value when it comes to, what is a good job, what is a high quality career pathway. The state also needs to define what stackability and portability means for workforce credentials and for programs. So to what extent does a training set you up for success in a career pathway? And to what extent is a credential or is a training program recognized by multiple employers? There's a few, again, other things, but essentially right now, as a state, we have a few work groups that are convened to develop some of the policies around this application process to define things like stackability, portability, to develop the criteria that'll be used to determine that priority occupation list. And I think the biggest lift is really that data infrastructure around calculating the job placement rates and the completion rates. So we're going to be using, I think, things like DataLink CT, formerly P20Win, our state's longitudinal data system. But there's a lot of work being done right now to build out those policies and that data infrastructure. Because of that, we're expecting our process to be completed in the fall of this year. This has to go through the Governor's Workforce Council, which is our state workforce board, and then be approved by the governor. And then we're expecting institutions to start applying to have Pell eligible programs over the winter, and hopefully we'll have some programs running by early 2027. So we are, I think, trying to move this forward as quickly as possible while also recognizing that this legislation is very complicated and there's some real penalties for institutions if they apply, they get a program eligible, and then they fail to meet that 70% standard. They can get removed from the list and they have a cool-off period before they can reapply. And there's, again, a lot of nuances that we're trying to work out so that we are making this easy for both institutions and learners. But that being said, I think the bottom line is because of all these criteria, we expect that once Pell programs are online, they will be very high quality, low or no cost pathways into employment. Because of all this accountability, I think these are going to be very strong programs once they're approved for Pell funding. That being said, there's still some trade-offs for learners. And again, this is where I think this group could be really helpful. Workforce Pell expends the lifetime availability of Pell funding for students. So if you spend Pell dollars on a Workforce Pell program, those are dollars that you cannot later spend on a degree program. So Pell gives you, I think, 12 semesters worth of funding. So there is more than you would need to complete a degree in a 4-year time period. But for students that are thinking about, should I go for a Workforce Pell program? Should I pursue something like WIOA or Career Connect or another state-funded job training program? There are some real questions there about what the optimal pathway will be. Workforce Pell, as I mentioned, is also focused pretty exclusively on tuition. So for students that have additional support service needs, whether that's basic needs, whether that's case management or career counseling, Workforce Pell will not cover those sorts of costs. And while many of our higher ed institutions do offer support services for students that need individualized supports or additional help with, again, kind of navigating the options, navigating those basic needs supports, I think there's going to be some unmet needs, and we're going to be really thinking about co-enrollment opportunities, whether that's with social service organizations or workforce boards, but trying to make sure that we are providing that wraparound level of support for students, given that Workforce Pell is only really covering the tuition. we're thinking again about entry points into these workforce Pell programs. Again, this is short-term training offered at post-secondary institutions primarily. So there's a role for high school guidance counselors that are helping students determine what to do after they graduate. There's a role for adult education program staff as they're thinking about their graduates who are getting their GED and wondering what comes next. Again, there's a big role, I think, for American Job Center case managers, other social service, career navigation staff that are helping learners identify their options and also, again, think through those support service needs. And so as we get closer to that early 2027 kind of launch where we're expecting to have programs online, I think, the more kind of insight we can get from this group around the sorts of questions that learners are experiencing, the kind of triage, co-enrollment, sequential enrollment opportunities that are available. We really want to maximize those sorts of supports and connections. So that was a mouthful. I'm happy to pause and take any questions or if there's any feedback. I don't see any in the chat, but happy to answer any questions the group might have.
I think it was very clear and noted that it's, one of the positive outcomes from HR1. And I think particularly appreciate you, Ben, kind of pointing out specifically how, advocates could be helpful. And I presume folks can reach out to you and their colleagues in Office of Workforce Strategies. So, we're all on the same page about this being really helpful. I see one question that popped in. It's a great question, Leah. I should have thought of it myself, but credit to you. What do you think, at least at this stage, are those priority occupations that, not to, no promises, right? But just, where are you at right now in that type of thinking?
Sure. Great question. Thank you, Leah. So there's 3 criteria that the state has to define when it comes to these priority occupations. They have to meet standards around being high demand, being high skill, and also being high wage. So again, the discussions we've been having in our workforce Pell work groups have been around what is the appropriate floor for earnings, the floor for demand, and what does it mean, right, for a role to be high skill. So I think we're expecting to see pretty much all of the kind of licensed trade roles being eligible. And I think the question in the trades will be, do the trainings fit that 8 to 15 week training period? And again, there's a lot of carve outs in the workforce Pell rules around registered apprenticeship. So I think there's opportunity there, but we're going to have, I think, some difficulty aligning some of the training there. We're expecting a number of licensed kind of healthcare roles to meet the standard. I think we're trying to, again, be careful with the way in which we're defining that kind of high wage threshold. So when it comes to roles like CNA, they're not necessarily high wage, but they can lead to some of those higher wage roles. So I think we're more focused on things like patient care tech or some of the other kind of technician roles that have a little bit of a higher wage associated with the role. But at the same time, recognizing that, again, a CNA can be a good pathway into those roles. Those are some of the discussions that the work groups have been having, but I'd say we're also looking at a number of manufacturing roles. So expecting, a lot of our core kind of machinist style roles will be available. And then also looking at in the technology space, again, a number of the more entry-level roles there. And I think the challenge in the tech space especially has been looking at the level of demand, looking at things like job openings, looking at expected kind of growth in demand for certain occupations. And so again, all these criteria are becoming, part of the conversation. And ultimately the state will be publishing a list of these priority occupations in its WIOA plan, and that'll be updated every 2 years. So we'll be using that list for the workforce Pell discussion, but it'll also be, I think, a signal to the rest of the state on the roles that we are validating using labor market information as having, again, all those 3 criteria: demand, wages, and skill levels. Bit of a long answer, but hopefully that.
Oh, this is why we invited you, Ben. You have all the right answers. So I appreciate you for being here. Thank you for the clear explanation. Yeah, I completely agree. And, while we're talking about, this is, again, kind of a way the federal and the state work together, I want to really give a shout out to our federal and national partners at the National Skills Coalition. who have a lot of resources out there as well about workforce Pell Grants and other federal policies. And again, the way the federal decisions come down to the state decisions and impact our, everyday workers and families. And that's really where I think we turn back to you all. Um, we are an advocacy coalition. It's great to share this information. We're constantly learning. I also, like Avi said, I learned a ton today. So, but the big thing that coalitions are so effective at is taking action. And so there are a couple of things that we're going to encourage you to do to get involved in informing and really being a part of this coalition moving forward. And just to be very clear, as you think you understood in the way we talked about the legislative session, we think that workers need a lot of different things to succeed in their careers and in their communities. Certainly, they need the job and the training that comes with it. But that's why we also talked about childcare that they need so they can get to their jobs, affordable transportation so they can get to their jobs. So that we're not exclusively focused on, if you're a workforce board, this is a natural fit, but, perhaps you're in a different type of industry and sector in your work. And we really invite you to join our coalition. Our next meeting is very soon, July 29th, and we meet virtually for an hour once a month and cover a lot of different topics, especially over the summer. But we'll be getting ready for the legislative session, which starts in January. And that's why we put together this policy agenda survey. You could scan that ginormous QR code to take it. It should only take a few minutes. Or you could go to the short URL right there, bit.ly/CWCT survey. It's only a couple of questions, and it doesn't need to be like one per organization. Like, you're welcome to submit it. We really just want to learn from folks like you who are just as concerned about having an inclusive workforce, having workers that are thriving in their communities, that we understand what we can do as a coalition to really help them in the 2027 legislative session. So please take the survey. Once you do, we hope you'll pass it on to a bunch of other folks in your community. We're a statewide coalition and we want to represent as much of the state as we can. So, you and your local community sending that survey to even 3 other organizations that have never heard of the Campaign for Working Connecticut makes a huge, huge difference. So notwithstanding there being any other questions, I really just want to thank you all for being here, spending your lunch with us, and also really thank everybody who spoke today. That would be, Meryl Gay, Kristen Hempel, Ben Henley, of course, my colleagues Cheryl and Amy Casavina Hall, as well as Jim Boucher and Kristen Hempel. So we are really here for you. We will share all of this. This recording will go out on YouTube, so you could pass it along. I'll make sure you all have our contact information. So if you have more questions or you want to get more connected to some of these things, we can do that. But in the meantime, I think I'm giving you a few minutes back, which I hope you enjoy between now and whenever your next activity is today. And I hope to see you. I hope to see your answers in the survey, and I hope to see you at our next meeting on July 29th. If you want to be there, just send me or Cheryl an email, and we'll send that out in the follow-up so we can get you on the list. Thank you so much, everybody.